Good afternoon. I'd also like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. And based upon the earlier comments and because of the nature of the group, I would say, just because I do bring a perspective that involves multiple states and being across the country, that in North Carolina, village, town, city, hamlet, it really doesn't necessarily mean anything other than what you'd like to call yourself, which was a change because, it is a change because when I was in Ohio, there were various population lines that once you crossed them, you moved from a village to a city, and it changed all the rules and how you operated. And I actually worked in one of those where that occurred. So in this, it's really about what you want to call yourself, which is a real nice thing in North Carolina. Andy said an awful lot of what I think I was going to say, except that, as he stated, two very similar communities, and yet we have our differences too. And we are in a little bit different process in Pinehurst in that we are going through our first comprehensive plan in Southern Pines. Andy had stated he's in a 5-year update cycle. When I came in December of 2004, the town had in place a land use plan that essentially talked about land use and transportation. And it dated back to 1988, and it had not been updated since that time. And you've seen reported in the newspapers and talked about in general places that our undertaking a comprehensive plan has everything to do with the notorious Pine Needles application and 18-month process we went through on that project. But in reality, I sat through 2 council retreats prior to that ever being even applied for, where the idea of a comprehensive plan was discussed at the council level. And every year it kind of got put off another year because we knew it was going to be an expense and we knew it was going to be an undertaking. And there was a feeling that the 1988 land use plan had served the community well. So in reality, by the time we came to the end of the Pine Needles situation, that might have been the final thing that tipped us over the edge of moving in the direction. But there were any number of issues that were coming before the council on a regular basis. Oftentimes individuals wanting to rezone property in the downtown area, specifically for office away from residential, for instance. We also had some other issues out there. Some of you may remember a Harris Teeter application that was before the council back in 2004 out by the community college in the Gardens, which happened to be in Southern Pines. So it was sort of one thing after another that deviated from the 1988 plan that finally council said, let's jump in and undertake this. As a result of that, we set up a 9-member committee and went out to a request for qualifications for firms to actually help the town with a plan. And that committee received responses from 14 firms nationwide. And Andy brought up a valid point. North Carolina does not require comprehensive planning, which is not the case in many, many states. And I think it showed in that we had a response of 14 firms. There were only 3 North Carolina firms among those 14. There's not a lot of it that goes on in the states, so there aren't a lot of consultants that specialize in it. We ended up narrowing that list of 14 down to 4 firms, conducted extensive interviews with those firms, and our selection was actually Studio Cascade out of Spokane, Washington. One difference with the Pinehurst process, Andy talked about their committee of 14 and how that was larger than the initial committee. We actually started off with a committee of 20 individuals, all of whom are citizens. The council worked very hard to make sure that every geographic area, every demographic makeup across the board was represented on this committee. And really, to the benefit or speaking highly of the community, we had over 120 applications to serve on this committee. So the council had a lot of very good people to choose from, and they did a very nice job of putting together a group of 20. 20 diverse people make for a very challenging group. If I learned anything through the process, it's that I don't want to work for a board of 20 at any time in the future. But they've been a fantastic group. They've dedicated a lot of hours and effort to this process over 18 months. But anyhow, we moved forward with that group of 20, where the staff, and Andy talked about the hospital and the resort being involved in Pinehurst. When Studio Cascade came in, the sort of kickoff, which allowed them to acclimate themselves to the community in addition to getting the input from these key stakeholders, they sat down and went through a series of interviews with each of my directors and department heads in addition to some of the larger landowners and business owners around the community to really get started off on the process. And from there, we moved into a very, very public process that, again, has taken place over 18 months. We had a long series of public work sessions. The average attendance at those sessions was well in excess of 100. And we arrived at that in two different ways. Some of the earlier sessions were one evening scheduled for a couple of hours, and we literally had over 100 people come out and show up at the gymnasium at the Boys and Girls Club / Rec Center. Then the advisory committee, concerned that a little over 100 wasn't really what they were looking for, said, well, let's try doing this in a series of workshops. So we would set them up on a Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday evening, and Thursday evening, just in case somebody wasn't available for one time, they could come out, get the same information, participate in the same events. What we learned through that process is it did bring some people in that we missed the first couple times around, but the numbers stayed about the same. Instead of one session of 100 to 150, we'd get 3 sessions of 45 to 55. But it was very nice to be able to bring some more people in and have it in various locations around the community. In addition to those sessions, and I should back up, because this was our first process, we had some committee members very concerned that we only had 100 to 150 showing up for these events. So they started making some calls, because there was a point at which they started to question whether the consultant was doing their job, whether they were doing enough to get people out. And what they learned in the calls is that 100 to 150 was actually quite an impressive number, because the reality is, unless it's terribly controversial, it's hard to get people out. We all have very busy lives. But it's somewhat a matter of pride and another just a recognition of reality. We actually had a greater turnout than the city of Raleigh has had in their recent plan. And I hesitate to say they're a little bit larger than us. So we were doing better from a percentage standpoint.